Yo, I'm masked today because somebody's in the room with me right now. So I'm behaving and I'm wearing my mask. I hope those were like challenging guys. I don't know. We'll see. Anyway, point being is I was feeling fidgety, so I thought I might make a couple of videos on irregular verbs. Some of these things are going to be relevant to you already. Some of them are going to be relevant later. Watch them when you need them. But I figured I'd go ahead and knock some of this out. And depending on how relevant this is to you is going to depend on which level Latin you're in. But this is actually useful for anybody, so feel free to watch if you're anybody, at least up to a point. I'll explain in a minute. And then also how relevant it is also going to depend on which verb I'm talking about. Right now, I'm talking about the verb edere, which means to eat, all right? And it's an irregular verb. Now, I'm going to go ahead and give this caveat of the irregular verbs. This is kind of the least useful one to know. I'm not saying it's not useful, but I can tell you that when it comes to like me reading, I see the other irregular verbs that I've made previous videos on way more often than this one. There's a reason why the Ecce Romani series waits until the Latin 2 book to put it in. It's because it doesn't show up as much as, certainly not as sum or volo, but it doesn't show up as much as fero or nolo or eo. It doesn't show up as much as any of those. So it gets put off a little bit. And also, the other weird thing about it, and this irregular verb video is definitely going to differ from the other ones that I've made in the past, is if you're looking at those principal parts, edo, edere, edi, essum, they don't really look irregular. From that alone, you wouldn't assume that there was anything that was going to be irregular. And part of the tricky bit with this is that it's not always irregular. It depends on which writer you're reading from. Because some writers treat these as the principal parts, while other writers treat these as the principal parts. Edo, essa, edi, essum. And boy, could you not guess that essa was going to come from edo. Not only is that clearly a stem change, which is what makes it irregular, but it also makes it look like sum essa, which it is not. It is not sum essa, but it ends up looking like it sometimes. So, yeah, like I said, this is tricky because some writers will treat it like a regular verb, and they would conjugate it like this in the present tense. That looks regular, and some writers will do this exactly, but there are other writers who would do this over here instead. Some of the forms still look the same. In fact, you'll notice it's the first person singular and plural, third person plural, forms that generally look normal and regular, even when we're dealing with other irregular verbs. But in the spots where other irregular verbs tend to get weird, these spots end up, just like the infinitive, looking like sum. So if your writer is using edo, edere, then they're going to use these regular forms. If they're using edo, essa, then they're going to use these sometimes irregular forms. All right? Now, I'm not going to go through the imperfect of the future because there's actually no irregularities there. It behaves exactly like a third conjugation verb. This is not that weird. A lot of our irregular verbs do this. Volo and nolo are the same. Malo is the same. I haven't made a video on malo yet, but I'm about to. So the fact that it behaves normally in the imperfect in the future, it's not particularly weird. I'm also not going to do the perfect tense because if you remember from my perfect tense videos, there are no irregularities in the perfect tense. Every verb follows the same rules. However, before I leave this behind, I am going to also talk about the present subjunctive. Now, if you're in a level of Latin where you don't know what the subjunctive is yet, then pretend this is the end of the video. Stop watching. Did you stop? Okay. This is on the present subjunctive for those people who know what the subjunctive is, okay? So we're talking late Latin 2, Latin 3, Latin 4. And this is something I often neglect to go over. I generally haven't gone over this with, Latin 3 or 4. And again, part of that is because this verb doesn't show up that much. It just doesn't. It's not a super common verb. I'm sure that in speech it was really common. People probably spoke this verb all the time. But in writing, this does not show up a bunch in Caesar or Virgil, our AP texts. And it does show up in some of the things I choose to read with Latin 4, but not as much as the other irregular verbs. Anyway, getting back to it though. So if you were looking at the subjunctive, right? And again, if you thought this was a regular verb, then you would treat it like a third conjugation, and this is what the subjunctive would be. And again, that's exactly what some writers do. Writers who treat it regularly in the indicative are probably also going to treat it regularly in the subjunctive. So you'll get the vowel change to an A, just like you would if it were some other third conjugation verb like kuro or luo or whatever, right? However, writers who treat this irregularly are going to do that instead. Edin, edit, edis, edit. Edimos, editis, edint. Which is to say they basically do it the same way that you would do the present subjunctive of sum or wolo or nolo or malo. It's like that. I know, totally weird. And the real annoying thing, if it's a writer who does this irregularly, is that some of these forms look like some of the forms over there, right? You could totally get edimos mixed up with edimos. And technically this one is long and the other one is not long, but you probably don't want to rely on that alone, especially if you're reading a prose author where you don't get to see the long marks anyway. And in the case of edit, the third person, there's actually not even a long mark to help you understand the difference. You would have to understand it with context only. Then again, if a writer would use this in the subjunctive, they would probably use est in the indicative. That's also dependent on making sure that you've seen est. Now, I didn't write up any examples. This is literally just to make sure that you are aware of this, that you know this idea exists. And now you do. And now you know what those forms look like. If you want to see other forms of edo-essa or edo-edera, however you want to think of it, feel free to just go ahead and look those up. But again, there's nothing strange or irregular about those, so I didn't present them. And if you have questions, let me know. I'm going to be right back. And by right back, I mean you're going to watch this whenever. But I'm going to be right back with another video or two on other irregular verbs that we did not talk about for Latin 1. All right, bye.